Hey folks, welcome to week 12 of Visual Design. How is everybody? Hope you are doing well, taking care of yourselves, and practicing with Illustrator. All right, so this week we are focusing squarely on the world of typography. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of typography, the psychology of typography, and then we're going to look at some of the actual functionality, the typographic tools that are in Illustrator. Okay, let's hop over to the syllabus. So here in week 12, we normally would have met April 14th and 16th. Like I said, we are going to talk about typography basics this week. We're going to talk about using various tools that are within Illustrator, such as the actual type tool, the type on a path tool, type boxes, typographic adjustments, and so on. We'll get to those in the second lecture this week, but here in the first lecture, we are going to talk about typography historically and as sort of a functional design concept. Meanwhile, in the background, you guys should be continuing to work on Project 2, Pieces, Parts, Pieces, where you are sort of tricking out that house that I gave you and making it really fancy and interesting. I can't wait to see what you are going to do with it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about typography. So typography, of course, is a historical design element that did not start out as typography. Like a lot of design elements such as use of color and layout, they sort of became formalized later on after the idea of design became sort of a more formal artistic endeavor. So meaning that if you think about sort of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and you had sort of these stone and marble buildings for either the government or churches or whatnot, and they wanted to put words up on the sides of the buildings, one of the options was to carve letter forms into the actual stone. And they weren't, picking out fonts or making them look fancy. They simply were using stone carvers tools to carve in these letter forms so they could be read so people could understand what the building was all about, what it was for. And it wasn't until the printing press came along that the idea of typography as a sort of visual choice really came into being. Now, early printing presses were what we call sort of single or limited use printing presses, where the item that was being printed was carved into either wood or copperplate and then put onto a press and then pressed onto a type of piece of paper. The problem with that type of printing, of course, is that after a while the wood or the copperplate would wear out and then you wouldn't be able to print anymore and you'd have to carve another one. Later on, Gutenberg invented the movable press machine, which allowed blocks made of lead to be available for each letter of the alphabet plus various characters, and they could be swapped around and locked into place to create a variety of different printable items. And this is really where large-scale printing took off. Now, two things really happened with the printing revolution. Number one, literacy rates went up quite a bit because if you think about it, early printed items, or early books, I should say, were hand created. They were done using calligraphy or other hand lettering techniques, and therefore they took a very long time to make. They were super expensive. Most people couldn't afford them, and they didn't make a whole lot of them. So the ability to read was really low because there wasn't a lot to actually read. Later on, those sort of middle grade printing presses we talked about printed more materials, and therefore more people had items they could learn to read from. But it really wasn't until Gutenberg's press where things like newspapers and large-scale book production really began to happen. And so therefore more and more people had the opportunity to learn to read. So literacy rates went up. So that's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened with the advent of the printing press and the printing revolution is that the idea of using letter forms started to be a more considered application. People started thinking about the actual shape and personality of the letter forms and wanted to give them some personality and some fanciness to them and make them look certain ways. And so that's really where the birth of typography happened. Now, it didn't really get named typography until later on in the early 20th century, when sort of graphic design as a practice became a much more demonstrable thing. But really, the way in which type was used could be called typography historically at the time. Now, the other side of typography, aside from its historical function and its literacy function, is sort of the psychological function. From a very young age, of course, we learn to read letter forms. And so much of our recognizability of the different pieces of letter forms plays into our ability to read, that there are actually sort of tools that designers can use that play into those things. So we're going to look at that as well. Okay, so let's talk about sort of the psychology of it first, and then we'll get into some of the history and some actual typographic tenets. Okay, so I'm going to move over here to this Illustrator file, and of course there's nothing here. Now normally in class we would sort of do this as a group discussion, so it might be a little odd doing it this way, but we're going to give it a shot anyway. Okay, so I'm going to put up one slide, and you guys are going to take a look at this for a couple of seconds and see if you can recognize what these letters are. I'll pause for a moment. Okay, so if you guessed that these are the vowels, A, E, I, O, U, you are 100% correct. And you might think to yourself, how long did that take me to guess that those are the vowels? Normally when I show this in class, it takes somebody in class less than a second to figure out that this is a collection of the vowels, A, E, I, O, U. Now all of these letters are shown in Times New Roman, which is a very common font that we're all very familiar with. It's just black letters on a white background. But as you can see, they've been flipped around, they overlap each other. And so why is it that we can recognize that this is the vowels by just looking at it for a second or two? There is enough evidence here in the letter forms that your brain fills in the gaps, right? Some students have said that like the peak of the A here, the shape of the U, you put those two together, and then this is probably an O, and then your brain immediately fills in the gaps. Because you have been staring at letter forms and learning to use them to read since you were so young, that your brain has this vast wealth of knowledge, not just about how to read words, not just about the phonics of the structure of words, but also about the actual letters themselves, or as we call them in design, letter forms. And so you're so familiar with the anatomy of these letter forms that by only seeing certain parts of them, or seeing them even overlapped or represented in a way that's not really common, your brain, once it puts a couple of pieces together, immediately figures out the rest. And it's like, oh, wait, I know what those are. Those are the vowels. So you, as a viewer, as a reader, you're very good at recognizing this. Now, if you think about that, all viewers and all readers have those same abilities. So therefore, as a designer, as somebody working in visual design, that means that when you are using letter forms, you can take some chances with them and not necessarily lose readability with your audience. All right, let's look at another one. So let me shut this one off, put this one on. Okay, what does that say? I'll give you a second. Okay, now if you can read that word and see that it says hidden, then you're right, it says hidden. Now this is kind of a double metaphor, right? It is the word hidden, and the lower half of the word is hidden. Now that's meant to be a little funny, but basically what we're proving here is that even if you don't show somebody the entire letter, they can still figure out what it is, right? Even though some of these could be other letters. This here, for example, this E, well, that could just as easily be an uppercase F, right? These two D's could also be P's, for example, or even R's. So they could be other letters, but there's enough evidence, there's enough anatomy showing of these letter forms at the top that your brain figures it out really quickly. So viewers are really hard to fool when it comes to obscuring parts of letters. Again, this is a tool as a visual designer that you can use to make your handling of typography fun and interesting and challenging while not losing readability. Okay, let's look at another one. Okay, now I always put this one up on the screen and I tell students, okay, of these two letters, which one is closest to us and which one is furthest away? All right, I'll let you think about it for a second. Okay, now if you said that the uppercase A is closer to us in space and the uppercase U is further away from us in space, then you'd be wrong, because this is a two-dimensional space, right? Now, if I was showing this in class, I would be tapping on the screen with my pen right now to show that it's just a screen and there is no third dimension. But really the point here is that this is what you call implied perspective. We live in a three-dimensional world. The human brain, for most people, we see things in a three-dimensional way. If things are larger, then they are generally closer to you. If they're smaller, then they're further away from you. We also understand the idea of a horizon line. And so if the A appears to be sitting on a lower horizon line, and the U appears to be sitting on a higher horizon line. Not to mention the fact that it's much smaller than the A, then it appears as though it's further away. Now notice that they don't overlap each other, so there's no sense of one being in front of the other. It's all implied due to the size of each letter form and where its baseline or horizon line is. So because we live in this three-dimensional world, our brain desperately wants everything to be three-dimensional. And so when I ask students which is closest to us, which is further away, they almost always have to say the A is closest to us. Now, of course, this is an illusion. There is no three-dimensionality on a screen. It's just two dimensions. And I may have mentioned this before in class, but remember there are three axes to pay attention to in design. There's the x-axis, right? And there's the y-axis, which goes from top to bottom. And then, of course, there's the z-axis, which you can't really visualize, but that is from back to front, meaning it's coming at you in space in the third dimension. Now, it's that z-axis that really this illusion is playing upon. And so that's another way that you can play with letter forms to basically show depth without actually having any depth. Okay, other examples to look at are these here, where you can intersect pieces of the anatomy of the type, right? So the crossbar on the A is intersecting with these pieces on the U, which are called serifs. We'll learn more about those in a bit. And so it appears as though one is bleeding into the other one. And even though this is not meant to sort of fool anybody, instead what this one is doing is it is creating some interesting negative space. You know, the white space around the letter forms, which is basically the paper, that is your negative space. And then the letter forms themselves, the black shapes, which are sitting on top of that, that's your positive space. Negative space is the interesting shapes that are left behind once you place objects onto a screen. And so this piece of negative space here within the bell of the U is an interesting shape that is being created by overlapping these two letter forms. In this way, what you're doing is you're treating these letter forms not just as readable letters, not just as the capital letter A and a capital letter U, which we're all familiar with from reading, but you're treating them as shapes, almost geometric shapes. So pretend you couldn't read this alphabet, right? There are probably alphabets from other languages that you can't read, right? Or if you were looking at characters from other languages that you weren't familiar with. So for example, Mandarin characters from the Chinese language. Maybe you're not familiar with how to read those, but you can still look at them and think, wow, those are really interesting shapes. And so you can appreciate them as shapes. You could use them as shapes to create designs or layouts or a variety of things, but you still can't read them. Well, we can read these because we're familiar with this alphabet, and so your primary inclination is to want to read them. But as a designer, you have to find that balance between readability and just using them as interesting shapes. And so reminding yourself, hey, these are also just cool looking shapes I can play around with, is a really good way to use them in the world of visual design. Okay, let's look at another one. Okay, this is similar, again with the A and the U, creating some interesting pieces of negative space. Also notice that openings in the letters like this almost sort of point the viewer's eye in one direction or another. You know, the uppercase A as well as the V is basically an arrow, it's a pointing device. Those can be used to sort of move a viewer's eye through a space. Okay, and then the last one to look at is when you get letters from one letter to sort of bleed into the next letter. These are not being moved around in any interesting way. They're sitting straight the way letters normally sit, but we've butt them up against each other so that they sort of bleed into each other and create an interesting kind of relationship between them. Okay, so the thing to take away from this exercise here is that letters, while you are familiar with how to read them, are also interesting shapes that as a designer you can manipulate and change by using scale and location and rotation and overlapping and even hiding pieces of them to make them more interesting and challenge your viewer while not losing that readability. Okay, so let's move on. Now let's talk a little bit about sort of the history of letter forms, and we talked about how these things may have started out with sort of carvings in stone and whatnot. So here we're going to take a look at sort of the evolution of the style of letter forms, and we'll talk about serifed versus sans serif type. So this slide here refers to what's called the old style of type. Now these serifs here, now the serifs are these little sort of flags that stick out from the edges of the letters. Now originally these were designed to replicate the marks that were left behind in stone or marble from the various tools like chisels that were used to carve into them. Those were accidental in the carving, but they became purposeful in the design of these letter forms. So these types of serifs, and you can see over here on the left there's a collection of them, transitional serif, old serif, modern serif. These are all different types of serifs. And if you look at different fonts you can choose on your computer, there's a variety of different fonts that use different types of serifs. You can read through here and just sort of learn about what they're all about. But then as sort of time went on, they began to sort of evolve. So let's take a closer look at some of them. This is the transitional serif. You'll see that this particular font, this is ITC New Baskerville, has a very, it's a collection of thick and thin lines, and then the serifs almost come to a point, as you can see here, almost like a chiseled point. And then this one here is a more modern serif. You can see that they're more rectangular and blocky. Notice that the letter forms themselves also have fat lines and thin lines, that sort of thick, thin look. And here's an example of two letters butting into each other but still being readable. Also the lowercase r and the lowercase n do the same thing. This is what you call an Egyptian serif. They are blocky like the ones we looked at, but they also have more of a curve to them as well. Okay, then we get into sans serif typefaces. Now these are a little more modern. These did not come around until later, when basically typographers, which by the way is the name of designers who handle typography, people who design typography and specialize in typography are known as typographers. Seems kind of obvious, right? Eventually they realized that they did not need to continuously design fonts that were replicating these old styles from carved stone. They could come up with new, more modern fonts that were not beholden to that history. And so sans serif fonts basically are fonts without serif. Sans is the Latin for without, and so without serifs. And these, of course, are more modern looking because they don't have serifs. They're generally cleaner looking. They have cleaner edges. They're a little more blocky. Sometimes they're rounded. And this here is Franklin Gothic Condensed is one example of them. And you are probably very familiar with sans serif fonts because they've been around pretty through your entire life. They're more modern. Now the third category of fonts, so we have serifed and then we have sans serifed, is what is often referred to as display fonts or decorative fonts or specialty fonts or sometimes unusual fonts. These are basically a large collection of fonts that don't fall into the category of serif or sans serif. The easiest way to sort of understand them is that they have a lot of baked-in personality, and they are generally representative of something historical or fantastical, or they very obviously reference something else. So these are the type of fonts that you would use in limited quantity because they're a little fancy. They look good for titles or posters or subtitles or those sorts of things, section headers. You wouldn't necessarily use them for large paragraphs of type. Nobody wants to read 200 pages of a science textbook in this font. That would just be difficult. Whereas in that case, you would go with either a sans serif or a serif of some kind. So we'll talk more about type usage later on, but just to give you an idea that there has been a history of the evolution of typefaces over time. Now, one typeface that we don't really get into here, but you'll see it's mentioned here, are script fonts. They can sometimes be categorized as specialty fonts, but I think they should really have their own category because script fonts very clearly are meant to replicate somebody's handwriting, and those are also specialty fonts for sure. Okay, so that gives us a very brief overview of the evolution and the history of typography. Let's talk a little bit about how fonts have been created. So this handout here, which is in the week 12, goes through a bunch of very popular and historic fonts and talks about who designed them and what the story behind them was. Now, this is a 12-page document. We're not going to go through this whole thing here, but you should read through this on your own. So just to go through the first one to give you an idea how this works. So this first one is called ITC Bodoni or Bodney 72 book. Some of the names for typefaces are a little clinical sounding. And here's a list of photographers or designers who actually designed this typeface. So this was designed by these people: Janice Fishman, Holly Goldsmith, Jim Packinson, and Sumner Stone. Sumner Stone, by the way, you will see his name pop up a lot. He's a very famous typographer who has designed a number of typefaces over the years. And so this was designed in 1994. It's not that old. It's a pretty new font, right? It's actually the year I graduated high school. No, wait a minute. That's not right. That's the year I graduated college. Yeesh. Anywho, so this is the typeface itself, and you can see that it shows all the uppercase letters, all the lowercase letters, the numbers, the various characters, and some of the foreign characters that are used for it. Now below it is sort of the history of it, how it was designed, who designed it, what was the story behind it, because the design of typefaces has a story to it. So there's a bunch of them here. Just read through them. This is textbook reading. Certainly read through them. Hopefully you find it a little interesting. You know, typography can be a little dry, but it is a very important part of visual design. It's basically 50% of visual design if you think about it. And there's a bunch of them. There's ITC Conduit, designed in 1997. There's ITC Samuel, designed in 1998, and so on and so forth. So this is just a really quick overview of a bunch of typefaces, just to give you an idea that there are actual people and designers behind these and how they're developed. Okay, the next handout we're going to look at is about text formatting. Now, this here gives you some sort of, it's like a pocket guide or rules for the road, as it were, about how to set up type on a page. It talks about various tools you can use. We talked about some of those a minute ago when we were looking at the Illustrator file. Obviously, you can change the size of the fonts. You can change the weights for emphasis, right? Sometimes known as type styles, right? There's bold, semi-bold, book, and so on and so forth. You can change the alignment of how type is laid out, whether it's left or right or center. There's also one called justified. You can change the case. Capital letters is considered a case. It's uppercase. So capital letters is uppercase. Small letters is lowercase, and you can have a combination of those. Title case is when every word is capitalized, and then there is all caps, where the first letter is a larger capital letter, but the rest of them are still capitalized, but they're smaller. There's units of measure. There's ways of measuring, like leading, which I will demonstrate in the next lecture, which is the vertical space between lines of type. Of course, space, also known as negative space, is that air around your letter forms. We just talked about that. The width of the type, right? Indents, you should be familiar with indents. If you're typing a paper, sometimes you want to indent. Letter forms sit in a particular structure. They live on a baseline, which is that imaginary shelf that the letters sit upon. The pieces of letter forms that fall below the baseline, like the lowercase p, the lowercase g, and the lowercase y, those are referred to as descenders. And the pieces of letter forms that go above the middle of the letters, which is called the excite, those are referred to as ascenders. Moving on, text formatting. So this gets into a variety of discussion about how to set type in terms of the size of the type versus some other elements involved in the type. Certainly do read through this, and we'll demonstrate it in the next lecture as well. Now, I give you some examples at the bottom just so you can see how different phrases look set different ways. So here we're using Mary Had a Little Lamb, which we're all familiar with, and it's done a bunch of different ways. This is Times New Roman, set at 24 points, and the letter spacing, which is the horizontal space between the letters, is set solid. What solid means is that basically you didn't change it. That's just how it comes out of the box. So that's what it looks like when you just start typing in a program. Now here it is again, still 24 points, still Times New Roman, but we have adjusted the letter spacing to 100 points, so you can see how much further apart the letters are from each other. And then this last one here is the same thing, but now it's negative 100, meaning that the letters are much closer together. Now think about what this does to readability. The first one you might read like, Mary Had a Little Lamb. The second one you might read like, Mary Had a Little Lamb. A little slower, a little more casual. And whereas this one, where the letters are much closer together, you might read as Mary Had a Little Lamb, much more quick, as if you're in a hurry. And so these different adjustments make a psychological impact on how people read type. And you can see the other examples. I've changed the typeface and made the adjustments, and now gone from a serif typeface to a sans serif to a script font, and see how all of that affects readability. Readability is king in dealing with typography. No matter how interesting or funky or fun you need to make your type, you also have to make sure it remains readable, because that's its #1 goal. Now, if something is too readable but not super interesting, then it can be boring. So you have to find that balance between fun and interesting and readability. And this is just a real simple example of that. And then we do it with paragraphs of type, right? Now we're dealing with leading, which is that vertical space between lines of type. Here it is regular or solid. Here it is positive with 21 points, where the lines are further apart from each other. And here they are closer together. So you can go through these and sort of read through them, see the adjustments on the right that were made, and just sort of think to yourself, how do I read these differently? Now, another handout I gave you is the typesetting guidelines. These are sort of like do's and don'ts about dealing with typography. We won't read through all of these here. Certainly read through them on your own. Just become familiar with them. They can become super useful. Okay, next, I just wanted to point out to you that over here in Canvas, if you go to Announcements, and you go down to the Week 12 announcements, Typography and Illustrator, there are 2 links to check out as part of sort of your weekly textbook reading. So there's those handouts that we went over, and then of course there's these here. The first one is a video, which is this one here. It is a really quick 6-minute video going over the basics of typography in a real sort of practical way. We have seen videos from this company before with regard to color and whatnot, so they are really great, and I think you'll like this one a lot, so check that out. And then the next link in the announcement is down here, adding text to your design. This is specifically from the folks at Adobe, and this goes into some of the nuts and bolts about how to use typography in Illustrator. We're going to go over our own lesson on that in the next lecture, but you can check out this video too. It is another great way to look at it, and it is super helpful. So the last handout that's in the Week 12 folder is this one here. It's also from our friends over at Adobe. It is Typography Basics Anatomy of Letter Forms. Now, this one, aside from just sort of casual reading like you've been doing with the other ones, this one I want you to actually study and get to know, because there is going to be a quiz on this. I will repeat, there is a quiz on this. If you notice over here in Canvas under assignments, now you won't be able to see this because it hasn't been launched yet, but under quizzes you'll see I have quiz number 4. We did skip quiz number 3, so you'll notice that's missing. We got rid of that altogether, but we are doing a quiz for typographic anatomy. Now relax, it's not until April 23rd. You have oodles of time to study for this. So what you're going to be studying is this particular handout here, and it goes through the different anatomy pieces of letter forms. So read through it here, and for example, we mentioned baselines, right? The baseline is that imaginary shelf that letters appear to be sitting upon, right? So you can see the graphic for each one. There's a little explanation about each one, and it's essentially vocabulary matched up with these visual representations. The quiz itself uses these exact same visual representations. So if you study this 6-page document, you will know them. The cap line is the top of the uppercase letters, the mean line is the top of the lowercase letters, and so on and so forth. There are a number of anatomical pieces, parts, pieces to letter forms. I want you to become familiar with them, because even though you might not ever become a typographer like Sumner Stone and design your own typefaces, knowing the anatomy of letter forms and how they function and what the different pieces are lends itself to being a good visual designer or working in visual design. Even if you work with visual designers, it helps increase your vocabulary so that when you're discussing the use of typography and letter forms, you know what you're talking about. It's much easier to say to somebody, hey, the bowl of the lowercase g seems a little bit high. Do you think you can lower that a little bit? As opposed to saying to somebody, hey, that round part on the top of the G, could you move that a little bit? So the more you can speak sort of knowingly and intelligently about letter forms, the easier it is to have conversations about them, to work with them, and to sort of understand what they're all about. So once again, this is the letter form anatomy handout in the week 12 folder. You're going to take some time between now and the 23rd to get to know this, familiarize yourself with it, and we will be having a quiz on it, okay? So it'll be great. It's not that big of a deal. All right, so I will talk to you again soon in lecture number 2 for how type works directly in Illustrator.